Plated Traditions Channel. Welcome to the Plated Traditions Channel with your host Kendra Moses. This is the Plated Traditions.
Hello and welcome to the Plated Traditions Channel. My name is Kendra Moses, as always by our resident chef Kai off camera. So last week we took a little break from our initial studies to talk about Mardi Gras, but we're back this week with the whole does it really matter section, and we're still focusing on the recipe. And I know it may seem painstaking, but the recipe is a very vital part. So last week we talked about what to look for in a recipe to make sure that you have all the information possible to put you in your best stead to go for it and make whatever it is you want to make. And then even before that, we culminated all together all the questions that usually come up with culinary arts, and we wrapped it up in one sole question: does it really matter? And that question is still a very valid question. However, as we continue our discussion this week, there is one other question that can't really just be tucked away with the whole does it really matter. And that question is, what are you talking about? The thing about looking at a recipe is, like I said, it is a learning experience, because when you take the time out to look at your recipe before just going out there and just rushing to execute it, you're coming across things that you may not be familiar with. And especially this can be the case when you're dealing with a recipe outside of your country. And this could even happen, to be honest, if you're dealing with a recipe that's just in a different section of the country that you're from. Because the thing about us is that as a species, we don't typically do the exact same thing when it comes to being in different regions. Our dialect changes, our vocabulary changes, and the way that we phrase things change. And so all of these even have to be taken into account when we're talking about things like recipes and cooking. Because when you're having that discussion, whether you're having it verbally or written down, what's going to happen is who's ever giving you the information and who's ever even responding to the information, they're responding to the information with the mindset of what they're familiar with, how they perceive the terminology or how they define the terminology. And who's ever giving you the information is giving it as they see it and as they interpret it. And these two individuals in a conversation are not necessarily wrong, they're just on different pages. But for all intents and purposes, in their regions and their sections where they are, they're completely valid. There's nothing wrong with what they're saying. But what happens is when you start communicating with different people in different places and areas, you have to make sure sometimes that you're all talking about the same thing, if you want something like a recipe to come together in the exact same fashion. So as we started out the course, we talked about a lot of different topics around the recipe. But when we refer to naming and terminology, initially when we first discussed terminology in general, like a few keywords so far, and I promise you we will be going through more keywords as we go along. But as we talked about certain keywords, we talked about keywords that they were what they were, the actuality of what it means to be this process and that process. When they were placed in textbooks and they were placed in glossaries, whether online or discussed to you by an instructor at a concrete brick and mortar school, it had already gone through a certain, deliberation of sorts, where this word means this, no matter where you go. So you see this word, no matter what language you speak or what have you, this is what this means, because that is the terminology, that is the definition. And then we've gone along in the course talking about the naming of food and dishes. So we were talking about that. We were referring to what can a dish be called in order to be basically that actual dish, in order to be authentic. Because the thing is, when we're talking about naming dishes, we're talking about a certain expectation. Now again, these expectations can change in different regions, because in different regions they might say, well, this is a carbonara, but they might have said, if they placed their own region's name in front of it, what you may know to be a carbonara because it was introduced to you in the Italian rendition. If you go to a different part, when they call something by their regions and then say carbonara, you're not going to be getting the same thing. And so that's where we talked about the importance of naming things and how that comes into place with knowing exactly what's being offered to you to eat and exactly what it is you're looking for, at least in regards to when you're looking at a recipe. When you're looking at a recipe, you don't want to just say, oh, it says carbonara, I'm going to go through this recipe and not question it at all, not look at it at all, and say, why would I need that when the last time I had a carbonara, an Italian rendition carbonara, I didn't see things like tomatoes. I didn't see particular items that would not be found in a authentic Italian carbonara. So that's when the importance of the naming comes in when dealing with recipes and dealing with, again, conversations you have when being offered food or looking for food. As far as, when you're going out to eat or when you might be eating amongst your friends and family. These are all important things to know and keep in your head. But the whole terminology and naming system goes even deeper than that, especially when looking at dishes and recipes. There is a different name for things where you're looking at ingredients as well. When I say there's a different name of looking at the ingredients in a recipe, I'm not even necessarily talking about the differences in the language. If you're looking at a recipe and it just has a literal translation like for tomato, so tomato is tomato, it's the same thing. So I don't want you to be that pedantic about it, but there are certain words as far as the recipe goes when it comes to certain ingredients. Today I'm focusing on a country that its native language is largely English. So this is a discussion basically about what are you talking about in regards to looking at ingredients for recipes when you're an American versus if you're someone from England. Possibly the UK as a whole, because a lot of these words tend to go over into these different areas as well. But primarily focusing on the English point of view, just to keep things simple for today. When looking at a recipe, let's say from England, you're going to see some subtle differences based on what it is you want to make. So for example, let's say you're baking. And let's say you're baking a dessert, a cake. Now, to start off, it would be more likely when looking at a British recipe that you will see the word sponge. The word sponge may be used quite a lot more often than the word cake. Here in America, we don't tend to really differentiate that much. When we have a pound cake, it's called cake. A double food cake called cake. A wedding cake is a cake. Everything that has to do with a dessert that has that similar texture and profile, we refer to basically as a cake. And it's pretty much as simple as that. over there, things tend to become a little bit more literal. In England, they will most likely use the word sponge because of the technique used in order to prepare the cake. Because of the different techniques used on either side of the pond. And that's how it's going to come down to. Now, sticking with baking, when you're going through the actual ingredient portion, there aren't many differences in the listing of the ingredients that should throw an American off too much if they're looking at a English recipe. But off the top of my head, there are a couple. Now, one of the main ingredients in a cake or a sponge is flour. Now, depending on the type of cake, there might be a specific flour listed, but most likely it's not much different most of the time than from over here. Over here, when flour is listed, it's either listed as flour. When it's just listed as flour, we automatically say we can use an all-purpose flour because that's typically how it's sold to us. Flour is typically sold to us as all-purpose, whole wheat, self-rising, cake, or bread flour. And there are other flours out there for people with gluten intolerances, but again, trying to keep this simple for right now. But when it's just listed flour on there, we say, okay, I could just grab all-purpose flour. And most likely that's what we have on hand, basically, in the average household. Unless you have some sort of specific requirement for a recipe or for your health concerns. But in England, you may see the word plain flour. Plain flour is pretty much the same thing. It's a flour that you can use with anything. So plain flour, all-purpose flour is one and the same. So if you're an English person looking at an American recipe, as you read the recipe says all-purpose, you know your plain flour work. And if you're not familiar with certain things like this, these little differences can make you very frustrated and make you ask that question that's so quickly followed behind doesn't really matter is, what are you talking about? Because it doesn't matter at the time about anything else except for understanding. It's not a bad question. We just want to make sure it's not a question that's filled with, particularly with any type of angst. Because these slight differences in the way that things are said and or written down can easily cause confusion. And then somehow we go from that type of laissez-faire attitude to asking every question or asking one question in a frantic repeated motion. What are you talking about? And it is just something that happens, and it happens. I think it's easy to say that it happens pretty much all over the world when you're encountering a new terminology, especially for something that you may be asking, why are they calling it that? And again, when you're asking these questions, because it's not even necessarily because the difference in the language, it's just a difference in the terminology used because this person is from a different country or even a different region in the country that even you're from. And so these are things that end up becoming little pests and annoyances, and we want to alleviate and get rid of those as much as possible. These are things we don't typically think about. We go to a recipe and we say it probably subconsciously in our head or probably directly. And we say, well, I'm looking at a recipe from an English-speaking nation. We're both speaking the same language, so I'm just going to read this recipe, and you probably even prepared yourself for, I know I'm going to have to figure out what's the Celsius temperature as opposed to the Fahrenheit. I know I'm going to have to measure it out in different quantities, like in different forms. So I'm not going to probably be using cups. I'm going to have to use grams. And I know I have to do all this, but it's usually that one extra thing that sometimes we don't think about, because we're speaking the same language. We understand about the difference in the temperature scales and the measuring scales, but we're not thinking that there would be different words, even for the same language, that there would be different words for the exact same thing. And for us, there aren't really, for our different languages in our different countries, or for our different verbiage or different vocabulary in our different countries, we probably don't even consider it as synonyms. We're saying they're using a completely different word. What are you talking about? And that's where that other question typically comes in at. And that's why it's so important to make sure you understand these things. Because even if you're eating out, now I admit, I do have a bit of a sweet tooth. I admit that I do like a cookie. However, if I went overseas to England and I looked at their menu and I said, they have a biscuit, just a plain biscuit. And I said, yeah, I want a biscuit. I can't think about the word biscuit with my American mind. If I think about the word biscuit with my American mind and they come over, probably look at me strangely and just give me a plate of cookie or cookies, I would be very disappointed. And I will really have only myself to blame. Because even a menu is similar to looking at the recipe. If I see, I'm telling you all this information now, but if I still take this information that I'm passing on based on things that I've picked up along the way, and I still go overseas, first day in the morning, and yes, there are what we call cookies available first day in the morning, but I came there with my American mind and still said, I want a biscuit. And I get a plate with one cookie on it, or maybe a handful of cookies on it. I have to take the blame for that, especially if I looked at that same menu and also saw that they had an option for scones. So there's subtle tips and context clues you have to pick up, and it's really up to you to make sure you pick these things up. That's why it's so important to really analyze that recipe without making yourself lose interest and without scaring yourself, but so that you know exactly what it is that you're looking forward to. Because even as a chubby American, I will not be looking forward to a plate of cookies first thing in the morning if I was expecting to have what I know is, or is as close to the American biscuit. And I wanted that with maybe some butter and jam. And if I'm over in Britain, maybe some clotted cream and jam. But I would have to ask for a scone if I was in England. And the English person would have to ask for a biscuit if that's what they wanted, was a scone over here. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you have a sense of clarity with these things. Now, if I continue to give my passport a workout, and I said, well, since I'm over here, I'm going to look around the UK and Europe, and I want to continue to travel and see what else it is that I want to see and eat. So it's the same things I have to look out for. Now, for these instances, there might also be, of course, the language that may change, even though it depends on the place. Some places decide that they're going to keep it authentic. They're going to keep it in their language. And rightfully so. So I might have to think of translating. Like if I ask for shrimp, for example, and I'm in a different part of Europe, are they going to know what I'm talking about if I said shrimp? Do I have to go and translate their word for shrimp? But the interesting thing about that, even if I have to do that for another country in Europe, I still have to do something similar sticking with England. But now, like I said, I'm traveling further along Europe, traveling further around the UK. I'm just working out my passport now. So I've worked out that in England, I have to say prawns if I want shrimp. But if I go to France, which is in Europe, I have more of a language differentiation now. It's not so much so as vocabulary. So now the region change has made it so that I have to translate shrimp or prawns into the French language. And so instead of worried about, okay, I have to say prawns now, I have to say crevettes. So I have to do these subtle changes and know which change to make at any given point. It's the same thing for eating out. It's the same thing for requesting food. It's the same thing for using the recipe. Especially if the recipe is going to be written in their native tongue or written in their dialect or written in their spoken word, which doesn't necessarily have to be the language, but how they typically speak in that region wherever they are and wherever the recipe was written. So also sticking with France, if I want French fries, I would say I want frites. So again, I'm not worrying about the whole English differentiation from American English and how they call for French fries or how England requests an order of fries. And I find it interesting, but I guess fitting, but the French don't refer to them as French fries so much as frites, and kind of rightfully so, being that the originator is actually Belgium, and then in England they call them chips. You will see these differences constantly, and that's why it's important to look at the context clues. Have the confidence to ask, what are you talking about? You can do it more politely than what it sounds like, but I phrase it this way because that's the level of frustration that I know can happen when you're going through and you're trying to understand something, especially when it comes to food and looking at a recipe. I was willing to bet that doesn't really matter is basically the most generalized common question, but it's not the only question. The other question that really stands up there with it is, what are you talking about? Especially when you're dealing with looking and analyzing the recipe and trying to figure out what is being requested of you as far as the ingredients. So we need to know the difference. Biscuit or cookie. Do I want French fries or do I want chips? Do I want chips or do I want crisp? Because that's the other side of it. What we know to be as chips here, they refer to as crisp in England. So these things are very similar. Now, it's not that uncommon for us to see the word crisp on a bag of potato chips, but we will say the word chips more quickly than we would the word crisp. So these are the distinctions that we need to know about, because do you want crisp with your sandwiches or do you want chips with your sandwiches if you're in England ordering out? So even down to us going to a different time of day when requesting food, even then, well, there's a word in England used for two distinct different things, but there's the exact same word, tea. And so they're not literally just having a cup of tea at the table. The times hopefully aren't that bad. They're actually referring to a full-blown meal. So what we know of as supper, they refer to as tea. So we call it supper or dinner, they call it tea. But they also call what we know of as tea as well. So it's a thing about keeping up, let's say, not only with the vocabulary, not only with the native language and the native tongue, but keeping up with the context clues too. Because if you're just popping around first thing in the morning and they offer you a cup of tea in England, they might say to you a cup of tea, or what's more commonly known as a cuppa. But if you hear the word tea and you're in a person's home in England first thing in the morning, take that as a hint that they mean the beverage, because tea is, in the sense of the main meal or the biggest meal of the day, is actually dinner. So they won't be offering you dinner in the early hours of the morning unless they're asking you to come back and visit, in which case it should be very clear to you that they're referring to you coming back at a later time for what you may refer to as the American as dinner or supper. But right now in the morning, they're just offering you a cup of tea. And a cup of tea is the same thing over here, a cup of tea. That's it. Now, of course, there are plenty of different flavors and renditions of tea leaves, but that's a whole nother subject. And also, that should serve as a good context clue to you for any confusion you may have. If they start offering you, do you want Earl Grey or do you like chamomile? They're asking you, do you want a cup of tea? So these things help us to learn about one another and help us to learn how to read and decipher, like I said, things like menus, simple conversations, and of course, the all-important recipe.
Traditions music.
Say what? Is that a towel? What the hell you talking about? Talking about recipes close? I got it near my snout. Looking at these words, what the hell they're talking about? Is it slow or orange? What's the measurement exchange? What's the temperature's gauge? Right now it's pound and take. Is it flies or is it fries? I feel like the recipe's trying to hide. Maybe telling me some lies. Just you, which word do I abide? I'm feeling stressed inside. To me it's all Greek. The words forming near my cheek is what the French speak. I know I'm a little meek, performing cooking feats. Is my supper called tea or is it a feast? And what about the crease? Which one will you allow? Towel from the cow. Maybe the bottle of oil that's got me all spoiled. Does it really matter right now? Trying not to frown, I just want some food down. I stuck my head in the ground. Now tell me what I found. Am I looking at aubergine, a courgette, a zucchini, a eggplant? I just don't get it. Please don't walk away. Just tell me what's safe. I promise you I'll let you get on with day. I want this food in my gut. Just tell me what, tell me what. What the hell you talking about? Talking about. Talking about
Thank you again for joining us for another week. We hope to see you again next time. Bye bye.